cider? Like, what was it doing?
Sulfites in it.
What was it doing to you?
Oh, it produced an overwhelming sense of impending doom. Impending doom. Oh, I didn't sleep that month. I didn't sleep for 25 days. I didn't sleep at all. I didn't sleep at all for 25 days.
How is that possible?
I'll tell you how it's possible. You lay in bed, frozen in something approximating terror for 8 hours, and then you get up. I eat beef and salt and water. That's it. And I never cheat. Ever. Not even a little bit.
My diseases were put into complete remission by an all-meat diet. If you use meat as a first food for a baby, their head circumference is actually larger than babies fed without meat. Their head circumference is actually larger than babies fed without meat.
Their head circumference is actually larger.
I'm actually mostly eating lamb, which I haven't really told people because an all lamb diet would get so much more flack than an all beef diet. I'm working on a recipe book, which I think is going to be good because I hate cooking.
5 days in, I gave up and I had lettuce, of all things. The next day, my arthritis and my mood had dipped significantly. I was itchy everywhere and freaking out.
And I've been eating nothing but meat. Bacon, steak, elk meat, a lot of extra fat.
Carnivore community. Carnivore community.
It was definitely the soy. Nothing changed in my life, and it was so dramatic. Like, I didn't stop crying for like 5 or 6 days. Didn't stop crying for like 5 or 6 days. It was definitely the soy.
A lot of people that I respect that have tried, like Jordan Peterson in particular, that guy's a fucking genius. And when he's telling me what a massive impact it's had on him cognitively, he said that intellectually he's at his prime. He said all of his immune system, autoimmune issues went away.
Carnivore community. Carnivore community.
Shapiro, will you bake Ruben a wedding cake? Okay, so, I mean, my answer is...
Well, I'm married already.
Right, he's married already.
It was my anniversary last week. An anniversary cake would have been nice.
Right, so the answer is no. And the reason I won't is because as a religious Jew, I do not participate in activities that I believe are sinful. Do not participate in activities that I believe are sinful. Producer Colton is forcing me to cook a turkey. Damn it. All right, here we go. I'm going to cook this monstrous thing. First, let's make sure it's dead. That's the first step. Okay. Now, I'm going to preheat the oven to 425 degrees telepathically. It's done. Okay, rinse the turkey and pat dry. This thing's large. All right.
Carnivore community. Carnivore community.
The globalists obviously are hitting us through our water. It's time to take control of our lives. It's time to not give our children and families these poisons.
It was definitely the soy.
We have developed the ultimate male vitality supplement. This is the answer to the globalist war on male vitality with the estrogen mimickers they've added to the food and the water supply. The estrogen mimickers they've added to the food and the water supply.
We're not covering Pizzagate enough, even though we covered it every day, to expose the Satanism and the occult and the code words for pedophilia.
Great American food. Do you prefer McDonald's or Wendy's? I like them all. That's a tough question. If it's American, I like it. All American stuff.
And this idea of patriotic food is alive and well and killing people today. For example, look to India, where Muslims have been killed on suspicion of eating beef.
Damn it, I love this country. I can't think of anything more noble to go to war over than bacon and eggs.
If if you look at authoritarian populism in the past, Germany had ideas of blood and soil that marshaled ideas of nationhood and of tradition of who it is that should do the cooking and who should do the farming, and the kind of authentically national food that should come out of the soil.
I'm talking about actual vegan Nazis, neo-Nazis who don't consume or use animal products. Yes, they do exist. Some of them even have vegan cooking shows.
Carnivore community. Carnivore community.
Impending doom. To me, the whole obsession with food seems to have a pronounced neurotic flavor.
Food. It's embedded into the very core of our being. Considering, we need it to exist and stuff. It's quite important to us, to all of us. Every single day we eat multiple meals. Unless, you're one of those IDW Evo Psych weirdos that goes on these 8-day fasts to increase your head circumference or whatever. But most of us, we eat pretty consistently if we can. This act of shoving things into our faces for sustenance is certainly not exclusive to fascists or anti-fascists. As a whole, the broader act of it doesn't belong to any particular group, really. We all eat again and again and again forever until we can't. As I'm sure you know, the never-endingness of doing the fucking dishes is testament to that. But we don't have much of a choice in the matter. We gotta keep eating. What we can choose, though, is what we eat, how we make it our own, how and if we make it more interesting, the rituals and festivities we develop around this food thing. It appeals to all our senses, not just taste. Sight, smell, touch, sound. All of that matters to humankind, probably more than we realize, and it sparks something very, very deep within us. And that's why food can be woven in so easily with authoritarianism, with control, with power, because it hits something so primal, because it's a necessity we would cease to exist without. And that's also why it makes up such a huge chunk of pop culture, of every culture, in fact. Our memories are trapped within certain food experiences from different times in our lives. It's just a lot. It evokes a lot of feelings. So it can be completely harmless and incredibly enjoyable. It brings people together and all of that. But it can also be used for evil. And on this podcast, we don't talk about harmless, enjoyable things, do we now? So we will be talking about the evil, well-established relationship between food and fascism. This relationship between food and fascism is one that has existed throughout history. There have been different variations, of course, different foods at the center of it, but always similar themes of dominance and power, exclusion, nationalism and or religion, masculinity and social hierarchy. Lovely things like that, you know? You can see echoes of it on the surface in pop culture characters that seem fairly harmless, like Ron Swanson, who sort of satirizes the whole meat and masculinity thing. But from that, it's easy to see parallels with real-world, fash-adjacent types like Jordan Peterson and his all-beef bullshit, his beef daughter. And suddenly, it's a lot less funny. Joe Rogan and his elk meat and Jim Bro ice bath lifestyle, Fox News screeching about Biden coming for your burgers. You can follow that path all the way to Alex Jones and his conspiracy theories about globalists adding estrogen mimickers to the food and water supply. There's certainly a lot of demonization of what are considered by these types to be quote-unquote feminine foods, like soy. I mean, there was the whole alt-right soy boy label a couple years ago as just one example. And then there's this hyper glorification of what they think is the pinnacle of masculinity, which is meat, of course, in the West at least. Actually beyond the West too. From personal experience, I can tell you that in Pakistani Muslim culture, meat eating is heavily tied into ideas of virility and strength, and cultures and people that don't eat meat are often mocked as weak. And enjoying sour and tangy foods is thought of as feminine, weirdly. But even though meat is a strong element in these types of views, it's not always the case, because in India, that dynamic is flipped entirely, where it is vegetarianism that is seen as pure and superior, and meat eating seen as impure and punishable by death even by vigilantes. Anti-beef sentiment has been used to whip up angry, murderous mobs in recent years, especially since India's extremely fashy, far-right Hindu nationalist Prime Minister Modi came into power. I've done an episode on the Hindu far-right before, but I will be revisiting the topic in more detail soon in an upcoming episode, because things seem to be really, really horrendous there nowadays, and sadly under-discussed in the podcasting circles that I'm familiar with. And then, even in the West, we see vegan Nazis and stuff. So I think it's really not so much about the specific food that is being demonized or glorified, but more about power dynamics and how that's used to control people and create a narrative. Heck, even ISIS used to post pictures of Western candy bars and chips and things to appeal to potential foreign recruits, to show them the comforts of home. I remember many years ago now reading a piece about a guy that was taken in by all that and who was incredibly disappointed when he arrived and realized that the supply of Twix bars wasn't as plentiful as he had been made to believe. And then he was thinking about going back because of his disappointment. Oh, and how could I forget all the weird food shit with fucking Donald Trump these past few years. His obsession with fast food and Big Macs. As the President of the United States, his eating KFC with a knife and fork on a private plane. The juxtaposition of those things, so completely bizarre. But I believe it has been said that these things being so public might be a strategic choice to make him seem more relatable, authentic, and, everyman-like. And in the same Trump era, we had the rise of the internet Nazis too, and got to see a lot more of their gross food pictures. Yay! Whether it was their, what they called anti-Muslim bread, because they greased the pan with bacon grease, or MGTOW chicken, which you will hear mentioned in this episode in more detail further in. MGTOW being MGTOW, as in men going their own way, which is one of these awful manosphere subgroups. I think it's been described as a male separatist community where they renounce their interactions with women. So, yeah, from anti-Muslim bread to MGTOW chicken, it's all comically gross stuff stemming from their hatred of others. But while all the modern manifestations of this intertwining of fascism and food are important to examine, I think it's equally, if not more important, and horrifying even, to see how these things have come up and been used in similar ways in the past, to note the overlaps and tactics so that we may spot it, or things like it, happening around us today. The two main things that came up when I was doing my research for this episode were the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, and then how Mussolini used fascist food-related propaganda to control people, to promote public order, and to homogenize people's palates, which sounds like something out of a dystopian sci-fi movie. Talia and I talked about both these things in some detail, but there's still a lot more that I found during my research for this episode. So I thought it'd be good to include some of the things that didn't make it into our conversation in the intro as a sort of primer and to properly frame this topic. Of course, let me add that I am not a food historian or any type of historian. So if I missed anything or got something wrong, my apologies in advance. Let me start with the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which was as horrendous as it sounds. It basically was a federal law that prohibited immigration of all Chinese laborers into the United States, and it remained in effect till 1943. This law didn't crop up out of nowhere. Of course, these things don't happen in a vacuum. Before this, there was growing anti-Chinese sentiment, anti-Chinese violence, which seems very relevant in the COVID era and with the surrounding anti-Asian and anti-Chinese sentiment and violence that we've seen in recent years specifically. The Chinese Exclusion Act was built on top of various policies that were already in place targeting Chinese migrants. And they were blamed, as is a common theme, for taking jobs and keeping wages low. In India today, we see that kind of resentment and animosity towards Muslims for having economic success as well. Chinese workers were referred to as rice eaters and were excluded and slurred on the basis of something like rice. Ironically, though, as people tried to exclude them on the basis of food, there was a sort of loophole where one of the only ways for Chinese people to enter California, for example, was by obtaining merchant status, by opening a restaurant. And it was through that these business owners could travel back to China and bring in family members as employees. So this loophole resulted in a massive amount of Chinese restaurants being opened at that time. I think now the US has something like more than 40,000 Chinese restaurants. Oh, the irony of racist and xenophobic laws in the US, resulting in the expansion of Chinese food deliciousness. Anyway, this Chinese restaurant boom sadly caused more resentment and fear-mongering. There were boycotts organized, fines imposed on people eating there. Police officers volunteered to patrol the restaurants because white society viewed these places as depraved dens of moral corruption. And these cops would just order white women out because they thought they weren't safe in the presence of Chinese men. Another ongoing theme in these moral panics is this sexual anxiety. Then there was Mussolini and the Futurists, which we talked about more on the episode, as you'll hear. The gastronomic nationalism is strongly present here too. The use of food as a way to form nationalist identities or to exclude people. It's just so effective because it's a way to control the most basic and immediate needs of people. And Mussolini used things like industrialization and canning, as in the canning of food, to standardize flavor and recipes across the land and to erase regional differences. Then there was Futurism, which was an art movement as well as a social movement in the early 20th century. It originated in Italy, and a guy called Filippo Tommaso Marinetti wrote the Manifesto of Futurism in 1909. And in my humble opinion, it seems to be a very IDW-esque group of pretentious, edgelord, anti-feminist tech bros, basically, circle jerking through art instead of podcasts, you know? Futurism glorified modernity, violence, war, and technology, and they wanted to liberate Italy from the weight of its past. They openly embraced and championed fascism, and they had this similar odd feature of positioning themselves as the only ones able to look at the future head on and ask the difficult questions, while they were actually ultra-conservative in ideology. Does that sound at all familiar? They wrote some pretentious-ass cookbook and wanted only pure Italian ingredients that weren't contaminated by other countries' inferior ingredients, which of course went hand in hand with Mussolini's goals. Some of their ideas, though, were less than practical, so they didn't quite catch on. You'll hear more about those in the episode. But there was a rationalization of the household and kitchen movement. It echoed all the fascist regime's ideas of, efficiency, productivity, domesticity, gender hierarchy for women, nationalism even, as well as tying nicely into the futurists' embrace of modernity. I found this particularly fascinating and IDW-esque, this idea that efficiency and strict gender roles in the household and kitchen better serve the fascist state and leave more time for maternal duties, which of course then directly contribute to improving and increasing the pure Italian race. Sounds like an article you might see in Quillette today with a little polishing, no? This was a time when clocks were popular things to install into your kitchen and to monitor efficiency. And recipes changed from things like season to taste or salt to taste to very specific numeric quantities and exact cooking times. Modern gadgets were encouraged because, rational, futurist, and fascist. Some of the modern rational gadgets introduced during Mussolini's fascist era included the juicer, vegetable strainer, handle-operated egg beater, and a mechanical mixer designed to help with prepping pasta. Great stuff. Just lacking like kitchen calipers or something to really complete the rationalization of the household. Like, how are you going to rationally measure the circumference of your oranges and apples, eh? And this food fasciness didn't end there, of course. To this day, we see xenophobia and food pretty closely intertwined in present-day Italy, too. According to an article from Eater.com, since 2009, town governments throughout Italy have been banning foreign or ethnic food shops from opening up with varying explanations. Apparently, Florence's government was worried that the city's Italian culture was being watered down through the proliferation of foreign food. And also, in 2009, the Tuscan town of Lucca banned Arabic and Chinese food, citing preservation of its food and agriculture, but it did not prohibit the opening of new French establishments within its old city walls. I wonder why. And, this food fasciness certainly isn't limited to Italy either. As we've pretty thoroughly discussed by now, you see far-right freakouts in completely bad faith over halal food, over gender-neutral gingerbread cookies, over green M&Ms that are supposedly no longer fuckable. You see mosques vandalized with pork and bacon products. Food has always been a way for awful people to target, manipulate, and exclude the vulnerable. The same tactics and fears resurface repeatedly. And, I happen to think it's important that we notice those patterns. Now, dear listeners, if you enjoy this show, please consider supporting via patreon.com/nicemangoes. Because this is entirely listener funded, and without listeners like you, creating things like this is impossible. So a huge thank you to all my patrons who do help me make this happen. These things could happen faster and in better quality. If you'd like that, please sign up today. And if you are waiting for a new installment of the Woking Up mini-series, I will get back to it soonish, I promise. I often need a break from that very heavy and emotionally draining project of mine. If you haven't heard it, do check it out though, especially if you are interested in the IDW and Sam Harris's brand of hackery in particular. I will link it in the show notes, but you can find it on the Polite Conversations feed on all your favorite podcast apps. I am gearing up for Season 2 of Woking Up as well, as Season 1 comes nearer to its end, but in order to even think about beginning that, I will need to hit my next Patreon goal. So if you enjoy the show and want more of it, you know what to do. You will get access to early releases and our brand new Patreon exclusive series that I just launched, as well as all sorts of other patron perks. And if you can't support via Patreon right now, then you can always review it on iTunes, retweet it, share it with your friends, talk about it. All of that makes a huge difference. Thank you so much, everyone. And now to the conversation part of the episode. And I apologize, I think the connection was a bit iffy at some parts, so the audio is choppy here and there, but mostly okay. Here we go.
Make sure that that program doesn't contain controversial subjects and you're not impolite to people.
No, definitely not, Dad. You know me. I'm never, ever controversial or impolite.
Yeah. Okay.
Welcome to Conversations with your lovable, never pisses anyone off, ex-Muslim host Ina, keeping it non-controversial. Hello, and welcome to episode 68 of Polite Conversations. Today I have Talia Lavin with me, author of Culture Warlords and writer of the very interesting The Sword and the Sandwich Substack. And today we will be covering food and fascism and fashy types of people. Hello, Talia. How are you doing?
Great. I really love this topic because it covers the two things I write about most often. Usually I write about them separately, but it's kind of fun to hear them together.
That's right. That's why I reached out to you, and I'm so glad you could make it on for this episode.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a ton to cover from like so many different angles.
That's right.
I mean, I guess food overlaps more or less with everything, which is why I love writing about food.
Mm-hmm.
There's no like sector of human life that food doesn't intersect with at some point or another, and fascism is definitely part of that.
Yeah.
Has been from sort of the earliest times men oppressed man. The way they did that was through food or lack thereof or whatever.
That's right.
Can you tell I'm trying really hard to sound profound?
No, not at all. But you sound it anyway.
So one of the first things that came to mind when you approached me with this topic was an article that came out years ago by the very funny and very smart journalist Andy Campbell, who basically wrote about like why does all the food that people post on like Gab and these various fascist forums, like why does it always look so fucking terrible?
Yeah, I have not read that article, but that is a great question.
Like it's just like the trad wives and etc. Like kind of they post their like food inspiration or whatever.
The McTow chicken?
Yeah. So that's another super famous example. I don't know if Andy actually brought it up in that article, but that's from David Futrell's blog. It was from a Men Going Their Own Way, which is sort of a subset of Inceldom blog. Basically, the guy describes how he makes chicken, and it's just the driest, like, it's just like put a chicken breast in the oven for like 1,000,000 years with no spices on it. Like, you don't need a woman, now you are living like a Caesar. Like, it was just like a comically bad recipe, just depressed in advance, because there are people who must eat this way, and I feel sad for them.
Yeah, for sure. And what are they trying to prove with the no spices thing?
I don't know. I think that they're just bad cooks. I don't think it's that deep.
It's like they're trying to prove that they can endure like the most tasteless, awful food, or some kind of brave move to cook your chicken till it's a rock. Like I saw a picture of this McTow chicken, and it's like completely white or beige and like a dried husk of a breast. Like absolutely not even salt or pepper, nothing.
No, yeah, it's truly a harrowing document, looking into the soul of a broken man. I would say that what struck me more, first of all, it was funny that this is their like revenge against women, is eating like absolutely awful food. Like that's inherently funny to me. Yeah, we don't need women. We can eat terrible food all on our own. And I'm not saying there aren't men who can cook. In fact, once chefs became sort of a lucrative and prestigious profession, they started muscling women out of professional kitchens as quickly as
right.
But it's just like, yeah, we're a men's independence movement, and we're gonna prove it by just eating the most tasteless and awful food. But also you'll see like, on Gab, on like sort of far right Facebook groups, these just like astoundingly, like impressively bad looking piles of goop. And I remember when I was tracking for Culture Warlords, I spent like a brain melting amount of time on Telegram. Just really not a fun time for me as a Jew, as a human being. Like,
oh yeah, I can imagine.
I don't recommend that to anyone. But one thing that sort of came up and was like a surprisingly consistent theme would be like cooking advice. Because there were all kinds of sort of fascist lifestyle-y, channels, and a lot of them were sort of emphasizing this back to nature, like live on your own, like get out of the Jewish system, stuff like that. And it would be like I just remember like vividly this sort of nightmarishly bland image that some guy was posting he ate, and he's like, yeah, like this is how to live, I traded this turnip for like nothing from the store, and it was just like this incredibly bland looking giant piece of meat, like with a turnip, just like a single huge slab of unseasoned turnip.
Oh gosh. Well, at least that's more elaborate than Jordan Peterson and Michaela Peterson will allow themselves to have, because that's just like slabs of meat and salt, I think.
Yeah, I think they only eat meat and salt. And do you ever listen to the podcast Maintenance Phase?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And Michael Hobbs has been on this show too.
Oh, awesome. Well, then I'm in great company.
Mm-hmm.
But they did a whole episode about the Peterson diet, and they actually like sent me the rough cut to listen to for like sensitivity stuff. And, the far right angle, whatever. Not to brag, I'm just really cool. But the really funny thing to me was that, like, about Peterson specifically, they were so nice about, like, well, he has these problems, and it's like, they were just actually super nice because they're very nice people.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously and they wanted to be sensitive to his issues with opioid addiction. But I, like, when that shit first came out, I was just like, I've been referring to Michaela Peterson privately to myself as meat daughter for like years.
Oh, that's interesting. I call her beef daughter.
Yeah, I mean, she's the beef daughter.
That's right.
Like, she's just like, yeah, like I got my dad to eat, and then it's him like going on all these shows and being like, yeah, like this diet will make you shit yourself. But like it got rid of my depression, except the time that I had to go to Moscow to go into an coma about it.
And also apple cider will knock you out for like 25 days or something. I don't remember anymore the exact specifics of that, but it was several days. He couldn't sleep. That's what it was. He couldn't sleep because of apple cider for 10, 12, maybe 20 days. I don't remember. Something like that.
Yeah, I think like you would probably die if you didn't sleep at all for 20 days.
Yeah, it was ridiculous.
I mean, it's interesting, like, there are many foods that, I mean, if we look at, like, the far right or fascists or fascia-adjacent crowds more broadly, like, when you get into the sort of manosphere, as with the MGTOWs, there are, of course, tons and tons of food associations there.
Yeah.
It's, all meat and there's the keto stuff, and there's just all kinds of, not to put too fine a point on it, of like fuckery, and, there's the Black Rifle Coffee Company, which I think like had some association with Kyle Rittenhouse.
That's right. They gave him like a sponsorship or something.
Yeah. Which, good job, guys. Doing great.
Yeah. Oh, and then there was, I think like about a year ago, the whole far right was like in a panic, fear-mongering about this absolute lie that Biden and AOC were going to come for your hamburgers, and like part of his plan for the climate issues was to limit Americans to 4 pounds of beef, I think it was. 4 pounds of beef per year. And that was based on completely nothing, yet they all ran with it. I think like it was Tucker and Donald Trump Jr.
Like running on lies? I'm shocked.
I know.
Shocked that be happening in this establishment. It's just, I mean, it's always funny covering like far right stuff just because so much of it is just lying and moral panics of various kinds.
Exactly.
But how do I put this decorously? Do I have to put things decorously? Many debates. Yeah, I mean, I think obviously food is this. I mean, one of the reasons I write about food on my Substack, where I've had this ongoing project of going through Wikipedia's list of sandwiches.
Yeah, it's such an interesting project. Like, what made you want to start a Substack about sandwiches?
Well, I had been wanting to cover Wikipedia's list of sandwiches specifically for like years. An old roommate and I had an idea that we would do it as a blog back, sort of the era of the blog.
Yeah.
And, now I guess it's more of an era of the Substack, so I ran with that. But, yeah, I mean, in essence, like, I love it because it's such a profoundly weird document, and the way that sort of the best of Wikipedia can be. Like, it's super democratic. It covers stuff from all over the world, and it is just, like, obviously people's weird fixations. The other part of it that's so great is that it's just like a lot of stuff I haven't heard of. So every week I learn something,
Yeah, and your most recent one, I think it was about the Pakistani bun kebab sandwich, and the use of the word burger in Pakistan as well.
Yeah, and you told me that you have been a food blogger.
Oh, no, I was a blogger about Pakistan and sexuality. Definitely not food.
I'm so sorry. I must have just gotten my listening wires crossed.
Yeah,
but yeah,
that's fine.
That was totally that was totally fascinating to me, and that's like the absolute joy of food writing is that I can, go in with very little expectations of what I'm gonna learn, and all of a sudden I'm like, oh wow, like the burger is like a very potent symbol of class. And like you come in, if you come in sort of ready to be surprised, you can like find out just so many things. That is like the awesome part. Like, a cigar may sometimes be just a cigar, but a sandwich is almost never just a sandwich.
That's right. And it was so interesting to read it from a non-South Asian perspective, because I don't think I've heard the bun kebab discussed from a non-Pakistani or Indian perspective like ever. So it was just interesting to see it from your eyes. And the whole...
That's the magic of the list. It's like, I've covered like all this stuff that I like, even American stuff I hadn't heard about, like bologna salad sandwiches. Like, what? I didn't even know there was bologna salad, and now I do. So, it can get really wild and fascinating that way.
Yeah, definitely. And even in the fashy food stuff, there's such a theme throughout history of food being like used as an indicator of social hierarchy and used to oppress certain people. And so I think the bun kebab and burger aspect of it just all ties in so nicely, because it is true that at some point the bun kebab, which is essentially like a more Pakistani version of a burger looking thing with a bun, and it can be potato or it can be like lentils and meat in the middle, but like with more Pakistani spices, and it's fantastic. But that's what I mean, like it's had a revival now where it's like this like trendy hipster-esque kind of food that is now more valued in the posher areas.
It sounded though like it was totally a street food, and what was interesting to me was like, New York, where I live, has a ton of restaurants with like, and there's no shortage of Pakistani cuisine, but except for literally one street cart in Flushing, I could not find anywhere that did a bun kebab, and that's like in and of itself sort of says something about the stature of food.
Yeah, because it's not your standard restaurant food. It's absolutely street cart food. But at least in Toronto now, we have like a whole South Asian street, and there are your restaurants, but then there are your more street foodie kind of. They're not exact. They're like takeout places. So they would probably have it, but
yeah, I mean, but so I think just to so I'm not like totally derailing the podcast, I'll say that I was thinking about the bun kebab is compelling in its own right, but also you have, I mean, there are so many like just totally weird ways that fascism and food interact. We were talking, in your lovely and exhaustive sort of pre-show, what should we talk about notes. You mentioned a topic that I was really fascinated by in my high school nerd, like I read a lot of manifestos, not like in a Ted Kaczynski way, like in a, I was like, I thought Dadaism was really cool. That whole sort of period in the art world where like a manifesto was sort of the thing to have.
Yeah.
I do think manifestos it's sort of regrettable that manifestos have gone out of style, because I think they're pretty
like associated with serial killers now, or mass shootings.
But like art manifestos and statements of purpose in that way, like they can be clarifying and fascinating.
Yeah.
But that is a different rant for a different time. Yeah, so during this manifesto phase, I came across the Futurists. And so they were an art movement in Italy in, what was it, the 30s?
In the early 1900s, I think it had like 2 phases. I think the manifesto was written in 1909.
Yeah. And so they were headed by this guy, F.T. Marinetti. And they were basically, I mean, there are echoes of them now in certain ways. What they primarily did, above all, was worship technology.
Right.
Like, right there in the name, like they just kind of believed that technology was good, like sort of anything that points you towards the future is inherently good, and that Italy needed to be sort of dragged kicking and screaming into the 20th century. And one of the ways that they expressed this vehement desire was basically by shitting on Italian food, which...
Right, they had like an anti-pasta campaign. It is so absurd to me when I read about that.
Yeah, because it makes you sluggish and brutish, which, to be fair, after having eaten pasta, I haven't felt.
Yeah, but okay, so their reasoning was not only that, but also tied into their open embrace of fascism. The pasta was like a heavier, more feminine kind of food that they associated with lower classes, and it just wasn't suitable for a more fascist and fit and masculine society as they wanted to create, because they were like early anti-feminists, and they would have fit right into like the YouTube scene or the intellectual dark web or the tech bros,
God, yeah. I mean, I think in some ways, like, so much of the world now is like unintentional. Like, they might not know it, but they are the children of the futurists.
Yeah.
But one of the things that really fascinates me, I mean, I am like, it was like the Futurist Manifesto fascinated me as a teen because it was like obviously evil, but also just beautiful. Mm-hmm. Which is very rarely the case for contemporary fascist manifestos. I can't remember ever like being super wildly impressed by like the beautiful writing on fucking whatever Stormfront.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it was sort of like, wow, this is a beautiful and evil shiny object, which can be fascinating in its own right. Mm-hmm. But I guess what I was gonna say, like this sort of imbuing food with very intense symbology. Like, that's definitely not new. Definitely not unique to fascists, and definitely not, like, it didn't end with the futurists. Like, so, we have this obsession with, like, meat is masculinity.
Yeah.
Now, we have, like, trad wives posting their shit cuisine on, like Gab and whatnot. And so, I think food is always a signifier, and it's interesting, like, what they try to convey with it. If that makes
sense. Yeah, for sure, because it's such a basic necessity and such an easy way to control and manipulate a population if you can get into their heads about what they eat, right?
Yeah. And, like, so they're, in the eco-fascist movement, you have people, like, talking about sort of clean eating. You have this fascination with sort of getting off the grid and like leaving the system, sort of thing. Some of the ways that manifests itself is obviously through food.
Yeah.
And it is easy to mock these food blogs that just, these food posts that just, like, look absolutely fucking disgusting. And right. I'm not going to refrain from that. They look really gross. And if you're trying, it's just like, man, you're trying to, like, recruit me? Like, in the future, I'll just, like, eat super sad, depressing turnips? Okay.
Yeah, and this might be a bit of an old reference, but do you remember Peter Sweden and the awful looking plates that he would post? And Paul Joseph Watson would, like, post, like...
libs are mad. Like, me putting, like, shredded cheese on salmon.
Exactly, shredded cheese on salmon. That's what I was thinking. It was just so terrible.
Like, the libs aren't, like, mad at you.
No.
The libs just looks disgusting, dude. Like, if you want to eat horrible food, like, go ahead. Just, I suppose don't force your lifestyle down our throats. As they would say, maybe. It's always funny. I would say that one of the elements of comedy to me is always when, like, people are, like, wildly unduly confident about, like, skills they don't possess in actuality, and sort of fast food disgustingness is always a bit of a comic gold mine.
Oh yeah.
But yeah, just to go back to the Futurists for a second. Oh, Back to the Futurists. That would be...
Back to the Futurists. Ooh, yeah, that's a great... I want to title this episode that, but we're not entirely talking about futurists. Otherwise I would have, but would have been a good title.
Yeah, Back to the Futurists. Okay, well, I'll use that for something. But they came out with actually a cookbook.
That's right, yeah.
And it's bananas. It's, like, all about... It sort of reads like a prefiguration of molecular gastronomy, actually. Mm-hmm. It's like all the experience that you have, and you should be, like, listening to certain music, and, like, of course, the food should be imbued with, like, the latest of technology. So it, like, kind of reads like, like you're going to, like, a horribly pretentious restaurant in the era of molecular gastronomy. Like, that's what it reminded me of. Yeah. But so, maybe Ferran Adrià is a big old fascist, and that's why he cooks like that. But you didn't hear it here. But anyway.
Didn't they also, like, I think Marinetti also advocated for the abolition of knife and fork? That's also one of those pretentious kind of things, like, oh, look at me, I'm so edgy and cool, and I want to eat without utensils because it's new and exciting. And the idea that they stressed that food was about the whole experience and the sensory thing of it and the aesthetic appeal rather than this gross, like, satisfying hunger. Ew, what is that all about? No, we're not about that.
Yeah, I'm reading a description of their sort of this thing that they invented that was like the ritual meal or whatever. It was like this multi-course thing, and it was like the second course was like third course was like the vegetable course, and it was just like a bunch of raw vegetables on a plate. And you were supposed to dig in with your face, and then whenever like the guests would move their heads up to chew the food, the waiters would spray them with perfume. Would pay to avoid.
Yeah,
that sounds horrible.
It sounds awful, and it sounds like something from a Cronenberg movie, maybe.
Yeah, or like you ever seen? This is going to be one of the more pretentious sentences I've said on a podcast. Have you ever seen the Petite? What is it? The Petite Charm of the Bourgeoisie. It's called. It's like there's I think a movie by Luis Buñuel, and it was sort of satirizing. I don't know what, like bourgeois sentiments or whatever. But like he imagines a future where people like sit. They they shit at the table.
No.
But they like sort of sit and eat in like little hidden rooms. It was kind of like, I guess, making fun of the arbitrariness of the fact that like we as a society have decided that like, you know, pooping is shameful, but this other bodily function of eating is very social.
That's a weird point to make. Like they're very different, but
yeah. Well, it's like the guy like kind of like sits in this like little booth and eats a chicken leg. It's sort of funny. I mean, I kind of get his point. I do think there are reasons why we like eat in public and shit in private, but like whatever, you know, it's all fair game. But the reason I was reminded of this was just because like the way the futurists tried to make it into this big, like food into this sort of ceremonial act,
right?
Like very, and sort of like make it part theater at least, like sort of reminded me of Buñuel's notion in that way.
Mm. So just going back to the pasta point for a second, the fact that they called it an absurd Italian gastronomic religion also fascinated me and kind of related to the IDW in my mind. I don't know how much you follow how they're now like going on about the new religion of anti-racism and, you know, like just calling things you don't like or don't approve of religion.
I mean, in fairness, there is a certain level of like respect for pasta, perhaps verging on worship. In Italy and also in my house.
So you fully embrace the religion badge for pasta then?
I would say that it's probably the least absurd religion.
Well, that's fair.
Sorry. That lovely New York ambient noise. No, I would say it's one of the less absurd religions I could think of.
Yeah, no, that definitely makes sense.
Everything about the futurists is very over the top. And I just the image of like sticking your face in like a broccoli and then when you come up to chew being sprayed with perfume.
Yeah, it sounds
or like
very unpleasant.
And they were like really, it's also like you shouldn't underestimate their influence when you talk about Mussolini in Italy, because also Mussolini, like of all the fascists, like had a pretty striking aesthetic sense.
Yeah.
Like, you know, classic image of the building with sort of the face on it and C written on it. Like, fascism in general is always very, was very concerned with aesthetic.
Yeah, I've done a whole, a couple of episodes on fascist fashion with ContraPoints a couple of years ago. That was fun.
Yeah, so, you know, it is sort of a whole of lifestyle thing.
Yeah.
Down to the food you eat. And of course the trad wife movement, you know, growing their own food, making their own food, all of that becomes a part of it. These ideas of sort of the romanticization of sort of self-sufficiency, of meat.
Yeah, exactly. And with Mussolini, the self-sufficiency was a big thing because it was just part of his fascist ideals that he did not want to be dependent on other countries for ingredients, and also part of the whole purity aspect where they wanted like pure Italian ingredients, and the futurists as well did not want contamination by any other country's ingredients. And yeah, they coupled their xenophobia with their self-sufficient, were very productive kind of views. Like, just like how they put down pasta, futurists detested what they called xenomania, which they observed in the restaurants. Like, restaurants and grand hotels of that time were always like, serving different culinary experiences, different types of foods, and the fasci futurists did not appreciate that. And again, everything reminds me of the IDW. I apologize, I cover them so much that I see things through that lens way too much.
I have to say, I pity you. I don't mean I pity you, like whatever. Like I cover sort of the scum of the earth, Nazis, and even they annoy me less than the IDW. Just because the IDW is just as fascist and just as awful, but they like try to sort of pretend they're not, and they're always begging the question in this like horrifically irritating idea.
Yes.
Is there IDW food? Do like the Weinstein brothers have some weird diet?
There was this now, famously mocked picture of the IDW members like having a dinner together, and I don't know if you know Gad Saad. Terrible guy, but it's good if you don't know him. But he was kind of mad at Barry Weiss for not including him in the original Welcome to the Renegades, or Introducing the Renegades of the Intellectual Dark Web piece. And he just like had a tantrum on Twitter, angry at her for not including him. So everyone started calling him like this D-list wannabe IDWer. Like, he's so terrible he couldn't even...
Saddest I've ever heard.
I know. Can you imagine? It's super sad to be desperate to be in the IDW. So everyone started photoshopping Gad Saad in like the bushes in this photo. Do you know the photo I'm talking about? It's like Sam Harris, Joe Rogan, Ben Shapiro, Jordan Peterson, Eric Weinstein, and they're all at this outdoor dinner place.
The Blavengers.
Yeah.
That's so funny. It's also just like, to me, I think, like, also a marker of just like how incestuous these fucking like things are is just like it's such a massive wink fest.
Oh yeah, and if you listen to their podcasts, they're all like on each other's podcasts, like they're just rotating. Now there's some falling out and whatnot, but before it was the same 4 people on the same 4 podcasts in rotation, constantly, forever, just talking about the same thing for years. Oh, so I'm glad COVID shook them up a bit.
Has anti-racism gone too far?
Precisely. And
people have too many rights.
Just asking questions, we're just intellectual. And this is about the futurists and pasta thing. Also reminded me of the IDW, is that the futurists also employed similar tactics as the fascists in their anti-pasta campaign by soliciting statements from scientists and physicists to bolster their claims about, pasta being inedible and draining you of creativity and intelligence and all of that. And that is very much the mission of, the IDW. Will raise an IQ. Here's a scientist that agrees with me, and here's another hand-picked scientist that agrees with me. Or, even about COVID vaccines, some of them have gone in that direction.
Yeah, and it's like, here's the one scientist that all the other scientists hate, and just like them, it's like, because, like, one thing that's a really, really common theme with, like, essentially confederacies of jagweeds is like the way that like being sort of universally despised is some sort of marker of like authenticity or whatever.
Oh, yeah. You must be doing something right if you're pissing off everyone.
Right. And it's like, no, you could just be being a jagweed. I love that word so much. I think it's very expressive, and it doesn't, unlike a lot of I try to be careful that my insults aren't actually slurs many times. And to my knowledge, I don't think jagweed insults any ethnic groups, so that's always a plus. I mean, if the jagweeds are insulted, I think that's the goal ultimately.
But yeah, and also they do this thing in their, new interpretation of futurism or whatever, the IDW I'm still talking about, is that they try to prove that they're not racist because they so often have to defend themselves against these accusations in which, they think everybody else has gone mad because so-and-so scientist agrees with them. But in their defenses, they often use things like, I enjoy food and cuisine and music of so many different cultures. How could I do that if I was racist? And they've even used terms like, what was it? Eric Weinstein used this term, xenophilic restrictionist.
What?
Just try to make sense of that.
That hurt my brain.
Yeah, it was designed to.
My poor tiny brain. Can't handle much more of this.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. I mean, it is interesting. Xenomania, like, I feel like so much of fascism is just like appealing to the sort of center or imagined center by sort of saying, don't you think progress has just gone a bit too far?
Exactly.
This, like, time-honored, fascist tactic, and this is a common observation, but, Hitler's main base, the people that sort of made Hitler, and made him possible, were not so much like obviously the brown shirts were vital, but like, it was the ordinary people, the sort of shopkeepers and the people who were kind of like, this guy makes some good points.
Yeah. The grandmas and the...
Yeah, it was the petite bourgeoisie that was really his base at the end of the day. Like, just as now, the people who are animating this sort of rise of fascist theocracy in the U.S. are, by and large, pretty ordinary people.
Yeah.
One of the things that was sort of a lesson for me as I was covering this stuff was really the degree to which, one of the things I did for my book was I joined a white supremacist dating site.
Oh, yeah.
Whitedate.net.
Oh, dear.
They've since denounced me as a Jew. But, I did a lot of, undercover talking to ordinary fascists. And
right.
I think it always behooves us to remind ourselves of the sort of, not to use a cliche phrase, but the banality of evil. Just the ways in which so many of these people, we tend to think of fascists as either sort of evil masterminds, or sort of, not we as in you and me, but I mean, people who are not as familiar with the landscape. A very, very common thread in the way people think about fascists and people who get embroiled in fascist movements, or who are drawn to them, they think of them as either sort of evil, diabolical masterminds or sort of downtrodden schmucks.
Right.
And, there's often an inherent classism in the way people approach talking about, who's a fascist, who becomes a fascist. And, it's sort of, I call it the legend of toothless Cletus, where it's sort of like people imagine the sort of prototypical fascist as being, someone who lives in his mom's basement in the South. They have this very sort of clear,
uneducated,
sort of fundamentally in some way not responsible for his actions. Either because of poor education or moral depravity of some sort. And it's really striking just like how durable that desire to preserve like a kind of like innocence almost becomes.
Kind of strip them of their agency and just blame it on some external factor. I saw that a lot with like jihadists and stuff too. When people would criticize them, there'd be a lot of people rushing to, but they're immigrants and they had to face a lot of racism. And I'm like, no, like I'm an immigrant and I had to face racism and I did not go that route. So no, let's not do that. Yeah.
Overlap between people excusing racists and people excusing jihadists is probably not 100%. But there is this sort of possibly well-meaning road to in the sense of like the road to hell is paved with good intentions kind of a way. This sort of perennial excusing of people who get embroiled in fascist movements. And what has been really striking to me, what was really striking to me in these conversations that I had with, men eager enough to sign up for a fascist website and also, let's say, naively hopeful enough to sign up for a fascist website that was so bad at attracting women, it like literally had a suggested flyer for that you could hand to random white women in the hopes they would join. But at any rate, like what was really striking to me in many ways, many surreal ways, the conversations really just resembled all the other conversations I'd had in my various forays into online dating. People are people even when they're fascists. And so sometimes the conversation would get around to food and it was, it's like, it was just like a very powerful reminder of like, yeah, these are neither super geniuses nor the sort of downtrodden white man.
Yeah.
Like the true, man of the masses, as like so many people would have you believe. They're just like people who eat pork and beans, or beef on toast or whatever, like, and they'll ask you what you had for dinner and then they'll talk about their racist beliefs. Like
right.
So, it was a very concrete illustration of the banality of evil, I would say.
Yeah, I suppose food does bring that aspect of everyday life into it. There was that New York Times profile where they did like this very kind of Nazi next door boy, like with the tattoo of a slice of cherry pie, and he's planning for his wedding next summer, and it was just such a weird profile that like almost normalized and legitimized the guy.
Oh yes, I remember that vividly, and it to the credit of some other members of the press corps, it did get mocked to shit.
Yeah.
By anyone with like half a brain. But yeah, I mean that's occasionally in interviews I'll say like like members of the mainstream media who get shocked, when like a Nazi doesn't like literally jizz a swastika like onto the floor while making dinner.
Gosh.
And like that's always the interview I have in mind, that and sort of the infamous Richard Spencer,
the dapper Nazi
interview, like one. But it like food did play a big role in that particular piece because I think they went to like an Arby's or something, or
a sushi restaurant, maybe I'm misremembering, but that's what I remember. But yeah, they did talk about and then we just ate and drank and had a good time, or
like fascists have bodily functions. Congratulations for figuring that one out.
Yeah,
like there's this very particular blindness to like the idea that like fascists, even fascists eat, fascists sleep, fascists like are human beings. That doesn't preclude that. Like again, it's this sort of like unless someone is like at all times, like dressed in a, Nazi bedsheet costume, like,
yeah,
their humanity, like the fact that they are human is a big surprise.
Right. It's not going to always be in that caricature form that, people expect it to be. So, and then there was that Atlantic article that was a couple of years ago where they were like, oh, where Lauren Southern has been for the past few years, when Lauren was making her comeback, and now she pretends to have not been a Nazi type ever. But that Atlantic profile of her had a segment where they were like, I don't know, with her and her then boyfriend at a restaurant. And they wrote this observation where, like, Lauren was eating, and then she asked her boyfriend, or she mentioned that her boyfriend doesn't eat anything that is not from a white country, so he will probably not eat ketchup because it has origins in China. And I'm like, that is, to be that kind of a racist takes a lot of energy and, like, research, really. You really got to know what originates where.
Also, I don't think ketchup originated in China. I think that's like I remember there were, like, recipes for, like, mushroom catsup in, like, England. And
oh, really?
Like hundreds of years ago. So, I mean, maybe it originated in China, like, thousands of years ago, but, like...
yeah, maybe. I mean, that's what it, like, let me read okay, I found the screenshot from the Atlantic. He and Southern decided to go out to dinner and to let me film them. Hutchison refuses to eat food originally from non-white countries, such as ketchup, whose origins are in China, so the two, facing limited restaurant options, chose the British-style Oxley Public House in Toronto's Yorkville neighborhood. So, yeah, I don't know.
I think that's also I think that it's interesting because it's very silly. It's a very good example of sort of how ridiculous and contorted fascism can make your life. And also it's probably inaccurate. I don't know, but like, it's one thing not to eat Chinese food. I don't know. Actually, it's one racist thing.
Oh yeah, there's a whole history of, like, the Chinese restaurants and the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, where the U.S. banned immigrants from China, and there was a lot of violence, and people were feeling threatened by them accusations of taking jobs and keeping wages low. And then when Chinese restaurants started becoming popular, there were actually... people were suggesting laws to prevent white women from entering those restaurants. Like, specifically because there was this kind of moral panic about them being corrupt dens of opium where white women will be, like, raped. And there's always, like, this sexual panic, They do that with Muslim migrants all the time, and...
yeah, and black men, like...
and black men and trans people, and...
Yeah. I mean, to me, it reads like projection. Like...
Yeah.
Especially given, if you look at, like, the Epstein Plane Manifesto, like, it was not... it was overwhelmingly white, let's put it that way. Or, like, the British...
yeah.
Bunch of white people, absolute nonsense to the last man. But I mean, I guess what sort of fascinates me, I think if I were, I wouldn't sit down in a restaurant with Lauren Southern. I can think of a lot of things I would do if I met Lauren Southern in person, but sitting down at a restaurant would not be, like, in the top 40. But, of course, like, it's like a quirky little detail or whatever. But you do see some elements of that in, like, the rank and file fascist chats where, that's part of the reason why, they want to become self-sufficient in food and learn farming and shit because they want to get away from like the Jewish influence and the foreign influence on food,
right?
Which does tie into the futurists' like hatred of quote unquote xenomania.
Exactly.
It's this idea of like, anything that is quote unquote foreign is corrupt and corrupting.
Right. And
we have to be insular. We have to limit our horizons because, then we might discover something horrible like egg foo young is delicious.
And Mussolini himself saw Americans and the British as gluttonous and not as industrious and productive and fit and masculine fasci societies like Italy's. So he chose to very publicly advertise his, strict and healthy eating diet, which included he did not like eating meat apparently, and he just had like bowls of cloves of red garlic and vinegar and lemon juice, and just it does not sound great, but it sounds like a kind of parallel with Peterson, even though Peterson is the opposite. And the scale of that, he does the whole meat and masculinity thing, and this stuff varies. There's like one aspect that's all about like social hierarchy and opulence in food and lavishness, and then there's one where they're like, oh no, we don't want to satisfy hunger and we're going to have a strict healthy diet because we are disciplined in that way. And then there's the meat and dominating nature kind of,
Yeah, I mean, I think the like signifier and signified in food, like everything else in human society, it doesn't remain static. It changes over time.
Yeah.
But like what we see in the sort of changing tides of fascist food fashion, say that 10 times fast, is sort of a, how to put it, like what's continuous is the sort of whole of life aspect where, fascism is supposed to sort of, fascism kind of very intentionally like colonizes your whole mindset and your whole being.
Yeah.
And that is both striking and quite consistent across, the like since Mussolini's time. It's this idea that like it's like when you're a jet all the way.
Yeah.
That it's this whole of life commitment. It's this sort of not just an aesthetic, but also has a very strong aesthetic.
Exactly.
So yeah, and I think food, is always part of these kinds of choices. So, whether now it's like, don't take away our meat or we'll kill you with a gun, versus maybe prior it was like, let's, abhor the decadence of the capitalists and, non-fascist capitalist countries via like eating our grain bowls of fitness. Ultimately you come to the same place, which is like, we represent purity. Our like way of being is sort of incontrovertible and unconquerable. Like we are sort of the ultimate arbiters of what's right and just and pure.
Yeah.
And, of course, it's also these notions of ideal physique are also very consistent across fascist movements and across time. So, contemporary fascism is rife with like wildly intense fat phobia. And I've noticed that,
like the golden one, that's what I was thinking of when I was looking at the Mussolini era, like posters, like wheat propaganda posters of like golden fit men with like, wheat just like coming out of their crotch or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, unaddressed fascist homoeroticism is definitely also a consistent theme. But, but I mean, one thing, like, obviously the fact that I'm a Jewish woman is, like, a huge part of the reason fascists react to me so violently. But another piece is that I am fat. Like, I am not sort of slim, to put it mildly. And that is definitely, like, I have noticed that aspect of my physique attracts almost as much virulence as, like, my Jewishness, which, considering how much fascists hate Jews, is, like, no small thing.
Right.
So that's definitely been something that I've noticed.
And that's interesting because often the people that are mad at me online, they get very ultra mad because they don't have anything to go by to insult my looks on. Like, they don't know what I look like, so they can't hurl the insults based on that, and that makes them mad. So I get comments like, oh, she's probably anonymous because she's super ugly. Or I remember Gad Sad again, the same D-list IDW wannabe guy. He spent, like, I think 4 days on Twitter tweeting about how obsessed I am with him. Non-stop he was tweeting about me because I had pointed out in some blog or publication that he actually was friendly with, like, Holocaust deniers and white genocide types. So he started then calling me Plumpy Pineapples because my Twitter handle is Nice Mangoes. And, like...
That's not even a good insult.
I know, but he was still fat-shaming me, even though he doesn't know what I look like.
Amazing. No, I mean, I'm very reluctant to appear on video. I've been doing some videos lately because I have been trying to raise money for the Mississippi Reproductive Freedom Fund.
Right.
So for the past few days, I've been just, like, doing absolutely ridiculous videos in my, backyard, like, hanging out with a sword, destroying various, like, items of food.
Misogynist cantaloupes and things. Yeah, I've seen it. It's good stuff.
Two enormous sausages, that kind of thing. But I usually am pretty scrupulous about not appearing on camera just because, like, the reactions to my appearance are very intense and vitriolic. But
that's so upsetting. It really shouldn't have to be that way, but yeah. Awful. I'm sorry you have to go through that.
Oh, it's fine. I mean, at this point, I have the hide of a rhino, as well as the face of a rhino. No, it's sort of like they'll take whatever approach they can, kind of thing. Wherever they think you're weak, they'll hit you. But anyway, the reason I had brought up fat shaming and obsession with appearance in the first place is because it's so consistent. This idea that fascists have had over, like, a long period of time of kind of finding and celebrating the ideal physique. This kind of like aesthetic of, like, what the ideal human being should look like. That's very consistent over time and appears in, a variety of different kinds of fascist movements, fascist adjacent movements, like nationalist movements and stuff, where, like, the kind of what a person looks like in their morality and their worth to society are sort of intimately interconnected. So, and I think, like, creating these sort of rigid diets where, like, this is how to be a true man, this is how to be, a true, like, pinnacle of fascist ideal, and sort of monitoring food intake that way, to me is very internally consistent because they have this obsession, this aesthetic and utilitarian obsession with an ideal physique. So to me, that's, like, I mean, obviously they also want to affect cultural change and, are usually wildly xenophobic. And so that's, another big part of it. But to me, like, it's like also, when you are in the business of sort of eugenically crafting your ideal human, you'll want to like tightly monitor what your ideal human eats.
Yeah. And often they're just plain wrong too, right? Like, I noticed that there was like 3 main fascist food propaganda campaigns, like wheat, sugar, I think. I forget what the third one was. But wheat and sugar. And those were the products that Mussolini wanted to elevate. And, the sugar propaganda posters and whatever had these like athletic men and like robust looking babies in their mother's arms, and obviously that's very old information. But now that is not what you would think of when you think sugar, right? That it makes you fit and strong and is so good for babies, and and then there was this like ongoing theme with the wheat ones of like inseminating the land, and the interrelated fascist notions of production and reproduction, and the Italian earth being fertile and maternal, and reproducing the perfect pure race while producing the perfect pure crops.
Wow. That's amazing. That's amazing. Literally fucking the earth with your wheat.
That's right.
Wheat coming out of your crotch.
Bosom. There was even like wheat coming from a bosom, and just weird imagery. But yeah, thank you, Talia, for giving me your time this evening. It's been such a pleasure to chat with you on this topic.
Oh my God, yeah, no, and I could and would happily talk like for much longer. It's like I feel like I could talk about this for ages. It's under discussed, I think, and also just sort of there's a great little phrase that Danny Lavery used to use in his Dear Prudence columns. It's like life is a rich tapestry, and like the story of fascism and food is certainly a rich and variegated one.
Yeah.
And I really enjoyed speaking with you.
Awesome. Take care.
Okay, bye.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Polite Conversations. You can support this podcast by sharing the shit out of it, making some noise about it, or contributing via Patreon. Patreon.com/Nice Mangoes. No E in mangoes. Also, you can follow me on Twitter @Nice Mangoes. If you want to make a one-time donation instead of a monthly Patreon one, you can do so via PayPal. nicemangoes.blog@gmail.com. Remember, no E in mangoes. If you've got an interesting story and would potentially like to be a guest, you can email me there too.